Good morning. Welcome here. I am the host here. My name is Cindy Friesen, and I'll be the host for this particular session. You are in the chapel, and the breakout session for this hour is titled Supporting a Culture of Life. Before I introduce our presenter, I want you to know that this session is being live streamed to our satellite sites in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and BC. It is also available to everyone who has registered and downloaded the Mission Fest Manitoba app. So please know that your image may appear on the live stream broadcast. And if you don't absorb all the content in this session, the video of each session will be available after Mission Fest is over on our YouTube channel. Our presenter today is Susan Penner. Susan Penner is the Executive Director of Life Culture Canada. She is dedicated to educating and equipping Christians and the broader public on the value of life, as well as providing practical support for women who are in difficult situations. Please give Susan a warm Mission Fest Manitoba welcome as she comes to present.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And thank you so much for being here. I'm honored to be here, actually, and to share a bit about life. My name is Susan Penner, and I'm the Executive Director, as Cindy mentioned, of Life Culture Canada, which is a pro-life organization. And we offer education on abortion, medical assistance in dying, and we help women in difficult circumstances. So as you can see here, we do the education piece, the supporting women. We have something called Generation Life. There's a banner there that focuses on reaching college-age students and high school students to help get them confident and on board with the culture of life. And then we have a ministry called Angel Baby, and that is support for women who have lost a baby during pregnancy, whether it's abortion or miscarriage or a stillbirth. So those are kind of the things the main kind of points of what we do. I personally became pro-life when a friend of mine in high school got pregnant, and just seeing how she was treated had a real impact on me. So on the one hand, it felt like, the church is pro-life and wants to support life. On the other hand, when one of their own chooses life, there was a lot of shame involved in mistreatment. So for me, it was really personal. I gotta do something and try and be hands-on. So I volunteered at a pregnancy crisis center for a few years. And then now I'm the flash forward 20 years, and I'm the executive director here of Life Culture Canada. So the premise for today is I'm assuming the people here support life, that, I don't need to make the biblical case for life. We do see in the Bible that God is a God of life. In the Old Testament, he many times talks against sacrificing children. We see in the Psalms where he gives value to babies in the womb when he says, I created your inmost being. And then further in the Old Testament, you see Jesus valuing life again when he welcomes the little children to him, which was unusual at that time, giving value to babies and children and women. And then also he uses people later in age to accomplish great things. So that is the premise from which I'm starting from. And so based on time, I'm just going to move on, skip that part, and then get to some more education. So when I talk about what the leading cause of death is in Canada, most people assume it's something like cancer or heart disease, but the reality is the leading cause of death in Canada is abortion. And this is just to give you some perspective. Every year in Canada, approximately 100,000 babies are aborted, and if you compare that to what you see for cancer, which is around 80,000, heart disease, which is 53,000, you can see the massive impact, the massive number of lives that abortion takes every year. So on the one hand, we spend countless research dollars trying to save people, which we should, trying to find cures to things like cancer and heart disease. On the other hand, we actually encourage these babies to be aborted in terms of women's health. So there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there for sure. Further, abortion is the leading cause of death around the world. According to the World Health Organization, 72 million babies are aborted annually. That's twice the population of Canada every year. So that means, of course, the 72 million lives of the babies are ended, but that means 72 million women are living with the physical and emotional impacts of abortion, not to mention the impacts on family, friends, and communities. In Canada, over 4 million babies have been aborted since abortion was legalized. Almost a third of women have had an abortion by the time they're age 45, and 20% of pregnancies end in abortion. So abortion is a big deal, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. A few years ago, my friend Candace called me over, and she was really distraught, and she just had found out her dad had wanted her aborted. It was going to be $200. The appointment had been made at a Planned Parenthood already, and then her dad ended up getting a $200 ticket for driving without a license. So they literally didn't have the money to go through with the abortion. And my friend Candace was here, and she's got kids, she's married, she's involved in her church, she's in her community. And again, in that moment, I was like, when life is aborted, that's just a huge loss, not just to the mom, but also to the rest of us as well. Like, who else should be here is a question I really ask myself quite a bit. So if there's one thing I've noticed in the past couple of years, particularly since Roe v. Wade was overturned in the States, is that Christians really are not equipped to engage our culture. We're actually floundering, I would say, to address what's the greatest human rights issue of our time. I think it's easy for people to assume that Christians are quietly pro-life. They don't want to, be political. They don't want to be polarizing. But the thing is, the vast majority of Christians have never even heard a sanctity of life message from the pulpit. And this silence is leading Christians to form their opinions like everybody else on social media, celebrities, in the media in general, in school. So I've found that Christians are feeling insecure about this, particularly when they hear these pro-choice arguments that make sense to them. So I think it's really important that we address this. Further, 4 in 10 women, and this is a US stat, it's hard to find good stats in Canada. This one happens to be a US stat. 4 in 10 women attended church in the same month they had their abortion. Only 7% of these women had talked to somebody at church about it before they had their abortion. And 52% of church-going women who've had an abortion have actually never even talked to anybody about it. So it's a huge issue, not just in culture, but also in churches as well. So this presentation is to equip and encourage you and educate you to speak for life and live with a consistent life ethic from the beginning of life until its natural end. We're going to talk about abortion and how it impacts women, as well as medical assistance in dying, since that is a huge issue now in Canada as well when it comes to life. And at the end, there's going to be a Q&A, so if you have any questions, make sure you take note of that, and hopefully I'll be able to answer. So what is an abortion? So one of the challenges with abortion in our culture today is that there's a lack of education and information. Classes on sensitive issues or sexual health talk about abortion as birth control, but don't actually teach what happens during an abortion or what the impacts are. Courses on feminism preach abortion as a pillar of equality. So we are all told to just blindly accept abortion, don't ask questions. So we're left with a culture that supports abortion, but actually doesn't know the full picture of what they are supporting. So I'm going to attempt to bring some clarity as to what abortion is and how it impacts women. I won't show graphic pictures or anything like that or go into too many details, but I'll give maybe a brief overview here. So an abortion is when the life of a baby is intentionally ended while in the mother's womb. So language like termination of a pregnancy or the removal of products of conception are popular kind of terminology to sanitize it. But at the end of the day, it's intentionally ending the life of a baby. Most abortions are done in the first trimester with the abortion pill or through vacuum aspiration. So this would be, 90% plus. And then we've got the second trimester and then third trimester. So in the past couple of weeks, I've heard numerous late-term abortions have happened. And people have a hard time believing that late-term abortions happen in Canada, but they do. And they say, well, it's such a small amount that it doesn't really matter. But the thing is, it's about 1% of abortions are late-term abortions. But when you look at that at real numbers, that's like 1,000 babies. That's still way too many. That's not really, when you use percentages, like it's only 1%, it's easy to dismiss. But when you think of it in terms of actual lives, it actually is quite significant. One thing I want to mention here, the abortion pill is rapidly becoming the method of choice for abortion. You know, it's safest, it's easiest, that type of thing. But what it doesn't address is the emotional impacts on a woman. So, for example, it's usually given to a woman. She goes home, she's by herself. She goes through with it. It's usually really traumatic, really painful, really bloody. And she's home by herself, usually doing this in private. And the thing is, I've had women talk to me and tell me they've had to move from their apartments. They've had to leave where they live because every time they walk in there, they think of what had happened. So while we kind of talk about these in terms of safety, in terms of medically, they're not safe emotionally for women, and that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. So if you research, these methods, I would venture to say that if people actually knew what happened to a baby during an abortion, they'd be less inclined to support it. So Canada has no abortion law, meaning there are no limits on these procedures. We're the only democratic country in the world without one. So how do we get here? This is just a brief history, just to give you some context. So abortion in Canada was legalized in 1969 by the Liberal government led by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. At that time, if a woman wanted an abortion, she had to go to this committee of doctors, and they had to kind of rule on her case. So if it impacted her health or well-being, then this committee would approve the abortion. So then the 70s and 80s were really tumultuous in Canada. So the name Henry Morgan Tyler may sound familiar. So he started setting up illegal abortion clinics in Quebec, specifically in Montreal. He set up, so he was performing abortions. He was arrested 3 times for this because it was illegal, and after the 3rd arrest, they just stopped arresting him. So then he ended up just carrying on doing abortions. In 1975, a petition of over 1 million signatures, the largest in Canadian history, was presented to Parliament requesting protection for the life of the unborn. Think about it. This is like before computers, people were using computers and emailing, and there's these online petitions. This is literally community groups in their communities gathering signatures, compiling them all and bringing them to Ottawa. 1 million. And you don't see this in the history books. Even to this day, this is still the biggest petition in Canadian history. So Henry Morgan Tyler continued to open up abortion clinics, and then he opened one up in Winnipeg in 1983. And the League for Life, which is actually life culture, except like in the 70s and 80s there, they responded. They bought like a section in the Free Press, and there's 36,000 people who signed that as well. They spent $50,000, which is, I think, nearly $200,000 in today's dollars, to advocate for life. In 1988, the Supreme Court struck down the existing abortion law as unconstitutional, saying that it interfered with a woman's charter right to life, liberty, and the security of a person. Their intention was that Parliament draft new legislation on abortion. So the Mulroney government made 2 attempts at this in 1988 to allow for early-term abortions, but not late, but it did not pass because of opposition from both abortion advocates and pro-lifers. So for pro-lifers, it didn't go far enough. That was going to be too many, and for pro-choice, it went too far. So it ended up that this legislation didn't pass at all. And then they made one more attempt in 1990, and the bill would restrict abortion unless a physician found that a pregnancy threatened a woman's physical, mental, or psychological health. That bill passed the House of Commons, however, was defeated in the Senate. So since then, there's been no abortion law in Canada. To give you some perspective, in Europe, most countries have a 12-week abortion law. United Kingdom, 24, Netherlands, 22, but as you can see, the vast majority of countries have these 12-week laws. So Canada is truly an outlier. Further, Canada gives starting this year in 2023, is giving $700 million a year for women's reproductive health overseas. So, for example, if we go into other countries like Africa, for example, and we set up women's health clinics, so we're really exporting it now to other countries to the tune of $700 million of taxpayer money. So what is the rationale for abortion? How do people rationalize what's going on? 96% of biologists believe life begins at conception. And even before imagery, we see that in the Bible, God says life has value in the womb. So how do we do the gymnastics in our head, I guess? So the main thing you need to understand is culture would say something can be human, but not be a person. So rather than denying that unborn children are human, since that is a scientific fact, abortion advocates use personhood theory, which essentially says that just because a fetus is human by virtue of his or her species does not make him or her a person. To be a person, we have to have certain cognitive capacities. So the problem is when you start identifying those capacities, you realize newborn infants actually don't have them either, which is why partial birth abortions even are being allowed and advocated for. Advocating for the right to kill healthy, full-term babies. But if there's no logical point where an unborn human goes from being a non-person to a person, there's no logical reason why there should be limits on abortion, infanticide. It's a natural outcome. And you see this picture here. This is after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the States. So this is one of the protesters. And so she's quite highly pregnant. And then on her stomach she has not yet a human. And yet she looks like, if she delivered that baby would be quite likely viable. But so there's this rationale that if it's in the womb, it's not a person. Princeton professor Peter Singer, and he is like a very influential philosopher around the world, he says a week-old baby is not a rational and self-conscious being, and therefore, there are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity, and so on exceed that of a human baby a week or a month old. The life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. So this is like a Princeton professor. This is mainstream kind of teaching in universities, to be honest. So in other words, we are only people when we have a certain level of self-awareness. Okay, but what about those with intellectual disabilities? Or what about those who have dementia or aging? So once the value of life becomes subjective based on self-awareness, it essentially becomes discrimination against those that don't meet some arbitrary standard of good enough. Who gets to define that standard? And how do we know when the point, you go from person to non-person? So that is really the crux of the rationalization. I'm sure you've all heard my body, my choice. So the basis of this argument is that bodily autonomy, basically if women are to be equal to men, they need to be able to control their reproductive choices, including the right to an abortion. So first of all, this hinders the equality of women. It's basically making men the gold standard. If you want to be equal to men, procreation, you have to be able to not procreate, basically. You must be like men. Second, it assumes the woman's right to choose is more important than the right of the unborn baby, who is human, but not a person. I'm just going to skip here. Okay, third, the my body, my choice argument. It doesn't take men into consideration here. They're saying what men think doesn't hold any weight. So the challenge is this leads to two outcomes: men who want their baby to be born and have no say, but more commonly, it allows men to have sex without consequences. So I see both. I see a lot of pain from here. I recently had a woman stop by. She's been married 20 years to her husband, and her husband's girlfriend, before they got married, had an abortion that he had not wanted her to have. And it's 20 years later, and he still can't recover from it. It's very traumatic for him. I hear that kind of story over and over again. So the dad has no say. But men who want sex without consequences is by far the primary reason men would support abortion and say, hey, it's a woman's right to choose. It's a vital birth control backup plan. So men can say they support a woman's right to choose when in reality that they support their own sexual freedom. And it abdicates men of the responsibility when it comes to child rearing and family. I know in my work, because we deal with women, there's not one woman I can think of in the last 2 years that has come to our office who would have chosen abortion if the dad had been supportive. And we also see how, particularly in a hookup culture with promiscuity and stuff, if you're hooking up with a different partner every week, every month, a man can literally have more than one baby on the go, so to speak, at a time. A woman can be pregnant once for 9 months. You can't get pregnant by another person in those 9 months. But there are cases where a man has multiple babies on the go. I mean, you even see it in culture. There's a guy named Nick Cannon. He's a celebrity. He'll have like 3 babies on the go at a time with 3 different women. He must be pro-life, but if you think about it, there's a lot of men like him who wouldn't be. So abortion is essential. So while abortion is a main pillar of feminism, I would argue it is the oppression of women disguised as feminism. Abortion benefits men more than it benefits women. So another rationale given for abortion is mercy. So here you see a picture of the Canadian Paralympic team. Is there anything more inspiring, really, when you see these stories? The abortion movement says that if there's a chance a baby would suffer from a disability or poverty or foster care, that is a legitimate reason to abort. On the one hand, we celebrate those who have risen out of difficult circumstances, and on the other hand, we are saying they should be aborted. I venture to say most of us wouldn't be here if we used that rationale in our own lineage. So in many countries, if prenatal screening indicates that there's even a chance of something wrong with the baby, mothers are encouraged to abort. Last week, I was in Vancouver speaking at Mission Fest there, and a nurse came to me and she told me that in her hospital, just days before, they'd done a late-term abortion on a baby because the baby had a cleft palate. So these things are happening. I know it's easy for people to look at that and say, well, that doesn't really happen. It does actually happen. And again, to think that if a baby doesn't meet some arbitrary definition we have of good enough, they deserve to die, is really discrimination. The appropriate response to suffering is to eliminate the suffering, not the sufferer. Medical advancements can cure a lot of things in womb already, congenital issues, and let alone after babies are born. And then we have social programs. We have countless families who would want to adopt. Abortion is mercy, is discrimination against the most helpless and vulnerable, the very ones we should be protecting. And I just want to take it one step further here. I really like this sign. I saw this picture. This is from the March for Life that just happened in Washington. And here her sign says, doctors said abort, parents said no. I love my life, okay? So you have a person who's disabled here, and she's saying she loves her life, she's pro-life, don't discriminate. And I think it's easy for us to project what we perceive living a disabled life would be like, and we project that and think, oh, that might be terrible, that would just be awful. And yet you talk to somebody with Down syndrome, super happy. You see people like this lady over here. She's happy. She loves her life. So I think we need to be careful that we don't project our own perceptions on what it would be like to be disabled onto people who actually are. Further, the Latin root of the word compassion means to suffer with somebody, to walk alongside somebody. So we often say, like, abortion is the compassionate thing to do. But the compassionate thing to do is to walk alongside people as they are going through different difficult things. Another rationale, and these are a lot of ones I saw on social media after Roe v. Wade, because, man, social media was was crazy after that. So that's why I picked some of these, because I think they're quite mainstream. So you can't stop abortion, you can only stop safe abortions. So there's this doctor, Dr. Bernard Nathanson. He was one of the key people who got Roe v. Wade introduced to begin with. He later became pro-life, but one of the stats to try and get the Supreme Court in the U.S. to approve Roe v. Wade was saying, like, women are dying from unsafe abortions. So they said 5,000 to 10,000 women, again, were dying from illegal abortions. So the co-founder of the National Abortion Rights Action League helped legitimize the claim that 5,000 to 10,000 women were dying a year from unsafe abortions, which is why Roe was needed. He later admitted he made those numbers up. I confess I knew the figures were totally false, but in the morality of a revolution, it was a useful figure widely accepted. The overriding concern was to get the laws eliminated, and anything within reason that had to be done was permissible. So they were saying 5,000 to 10,000 a year. The Centers for Disease Control reported that 39 women had died from illegal abortion in the US, and 24 had died from legal abortion. That was just in the year prior to Roe. And then further, it says that 90% of illegal abortions were performed by physicians. So yes, illegal abortions will still take place, but not in the way that it sounds when you say, you know what, like thousands of women will be dying. That is not actually the case. And these are why stats and kind of understanding some of the stuff is so important. So when you see these arguments, you're not immediately like, oh yeah, well, yeah, that makes sense. Because often when you dig a little deeper, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. So another one, if abortion is prevented, kids will be abused and end up in foster care. So first of all, this is a false dichotomy. It's not either abortion or abused. Second, there's a study called the Turnaway Study. This study was trying to prove that abortion is no big deal and women don't have long-term consequences from it. But the data actually showed as well is that when women were denied an abortion, for whatever reason, either they were too far along when they went to the clinic, again, this is in the States, for whatever reason, 75% of them actually ended up keeping their baby and not pursuing an abortion elsewhere. 90%, of those 75% kept their baby, and 96% were happy they did not abort. So it's not like if a child is born when the mom wanted an abortion, that baby won't be loved. Women are bonded. Most women want to have their babies, actually. So these are important stats, right? So it's not necessarily that these kids will end up in foster care or abused. And then other reasons, rape. Rape is awful. I don't think I even need to say how awful it is. It's probably one of the worst things that can happen to a woman. That's not the debate here. But statistically, less than 1% of abortions are done as a result of rape. The other one I want to mention is teenage pregnancy, which again isn't ideal, but teenage pregnancies account for 2.3% of abortions. The point with this is these can be red herrings, so these cases are terrible. But cases that impact 1% or less of the population should not be the basis for a broad law. So even if you had a law that said, abortion, no abortion except in the case of rape, for example, like in Canada, that means 99,000 babies wouldn't be aborted. So I think when we want to talk to people about it and they bring up rape, for example, because that's a common one, it's like acknowledge, yeah, that is horrible. Those are difficult situations. But does that mean the 99% should be, able to be aborted? So these are some of the things, again, it's important to know because it gives us confidence. And it helps us kind of, discuss these things with people in a more reasonable way. In general, hard cases like rape or teenage pregnancy should not be the basis for broad general laws. So what about women? So abortion is just a really political debate already. But the reality of a woman with an unwanted pregnancy is fear and confusion and heartache. Most women feel a sense of attachment and protectiveness over the baby. And it actually comes as a surprise when they feel that way because they've been told from day one, abortion is no big deal. So then they have these feelings and then they think there's something like that's weird, or they're almost ashamed of these feelings because it's not supposed to be a big deal. I want to see if this video works here. This is a TikTok that I recently saw. Things I learned were hard after an abortion. Despite family support, this was the most isolated and lonely I felt. Fear of how this will haunt me when I become a mom. How painful the procedure was and always having flashbacks. Being torn, the pressure I put on myself for career now. Constantly wondering who you would have been. The daily what ifs. So there's actually a lot of these videos on TikTok. So TikTok's good for something, everyone. There's a lot more girls who are opening up about their experiences. And now what I have here are like this post got just thousands of comments. And I just want to read some of them. People really don't understand the pain and guilt felt after going through this. I cried watching this. You're not alone. Thank you for making me feel less alone. 5 years since mine, and I still grieve something that I 100% know I didn't want at the time. I can relate to this. I had an abortion and didn't tell anyone for a year. Like the constant wishing who they would have been. Like there's just like so many girls who are dealing with these post-abortive impacts. There's a Twitter account called Shout Your Abortion, and it's supposed to like destigmatize abortion. Just want to read a couple of comments I saw in there. Up until the pregnancy passed, I was very pragmatic and detached from the entire situation. I approached it in a very emotionless and clinical way. Nobody warned me about the grief and loss I would feel afterwards. I've cried every day since, and it's so confusing and overwhelming. I have no regrets whatsoever. I don't feel guilty because I truly believe people are entitled to decide what happens to their body. But I thought all I would feel is relief. But I feel sadness too, trying to make sense of these feelings, etc. This is another one. I still cry when I think about any of this almost 6 years later. I've coped this long by not thinking about it. I never got to grieve, etc. I stand by my choice. I cannot imagine my life any other direction. So on the one hand, you have all these women with these regrets, and it's the worst experience they've had, but I stand by it. So it's this really interesting dynamic that plays out. And when I read these things and deal with the women I deal with, I mean, how can we not care about it? On the one hand, we want to care about the life of the baby, but what about all these women who are struggling really with PTSD and post-abortive impacts? One woman told me she needs abortion to be okay and legal, otherwise she wouldn't be able to live with herself. A 2017 study published in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons found that 74% of post-abortive women admitted their decision was not free from even subtle pressure. You know, 66% said they knew in their hearts they were making a mistake when they underwent the abortion. There's a lot of post-abortion impact. And the other thing is, maybe I mentioned this, but in my experience, if there is support from the father or from the family of the woman, she will most likely keep her baby. So it just shows how important it is for us to walk alongside people who may be going through this. The other interesting thing, lately I've started hearing from siblings of babies that were aborted. This I hadn't heard till recently, but now I've gotten multiple messages and comments from women saying, like, I'm an only child. My mom aborted my sister, and I can't stop grieving because I've always wanted a sibling, and I could have a sibling. So there's all these bigger impacts than just, it's just a woman's decision, right? And those are the things I think we need to talk about so people have an understanding, and women, when they're debating what they want to do, kind of have a bigger picture understanding what's going on. So I would say if the inherent value of life isn't enough to convince us, the impacts on women should be enough to convince us that abortion is wrong. So why is this happening? I would say there's a few factors here. The sexual revolution is one of them. So the sexual revolution of the 60s was a social movement that challenged traditional codes of sexual behavior, essentially giving women the green light to have casual sex. And the birth control pill was also introduced around that time. So this just led to increase in unwanted pregnancies. So basically, the sexual revolution, the main impact of it, that sex is just a physical act. It's not emotional. But the results are really disastrous. Whether you look at STDs, sex trafficking, pornography, this whole sexual culture now is just really damaging. And abortion obviously is one of the impacts of that. Casual sex has caused an extraordinary amount of pain for women. It is so destructive, particularly to young women. Studies show that women prefer long-term relationships and committed monogamy, so women are actually suppressing their instincts and supposed to celebrate it as empowerment. I know a 15-year-old girl who lost her virginity to a hockey player recently. I thought he was like the one. And after they had sex, he broke up with her. And she also found out he'd been sleeping with, a lot of other women or a lot of other girls as well. So now this 15-year-old girl is dealing with all the outcome of that at 15, right? Now what's the point? And then she becomes more promiscuous because what's the point? She screwed up. So it's really complicated, and I think we really need to be sensitive to this whole hookup culture and casual sex culture we're in. Well, the good news is, though, the secular world is catching on. These are two really good secular books. They're pretty straightforward, though. They're definitely not Christian, but they are really great books that talk about the negative impact our sex culture is having on women. So Rethinking Sex by Christine Emba. I believe she's a columnist in the Washington Post. And then The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry is outstanding. I think these books, particularly this one, is going to have a huge impact on women, women in the culture we're living in. What's interesting, too, is that in 2020, there were around 41 legal abortions per 100 live births among unmarried women in the United States. In comparison, the rate of abortion per live births among married women was 5. So you can even tell how long-term relationships, marriage, positively impact family and children, because there's a great big difference between if you get pregnant when you're single versus when you get pregnant when you are married. The material worldview is a second impact. I think this is another root of this abortion culture we're in. So materialism refers to the theory that that physical matter is all there is. So everything in the universe is matter without any true spiritual or intellectual existence. So abortion is just a surgical procedure. There's not regard for the baby's inherent value. I mean, this lack of, as Christians, we have a view of the afterlife. We know that this isn't it. Imagine living without that view, that once we die, that's just it. That's a really hopeless way to live. And then you also have to try and give your life more meaning now. So hedonism, sexual pleasure is really a big part of that as well. So I think that's really played into this current culture. Having said that, there are secular pro-life groups that are doing incredible work. They have sound scientific and philosophical arguments for why abortion is wrong. You really don't need to be a Christian to be pro-life. And the other point, I think I had it on here. I don't have a slide for it, but personal autonomy is really big. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about MAiD. But this business that, my decisions are my decisions, and I can do what I want, only worrying about how it impacts, me. The challenge is our decisions do impact others. I mean, I see it all the time. Whether you see a woman who has an abortion, the impacts on the father, or the impacts on the family, the impacts on her. I'll talk a little bit more about that with MAiD, but personal autonomy can only go so far, I think, in rationalizing some of these really big decisions. So as you can see, abortion ends the life of a baby and is harmful to women. It should not be controversial to support life. It really shouldn't. It should be a given. So I want to, unfortunately now, in the last 5 years, now we have to start addressing medical assistance in dying, which is something we've added to our ministry as well. So MAiD is the Canadian legislation that allows physicians, nurse practitioners, and pharmacists to carry out euthanasia and assisted suicide. So assisted suicide is a provision of a prescription of a drug that the eligible person takes themselves in order to bring about their own death. Euthanasia is the direct administration of a substance that causes death, such as the injection of a drug. And that would be administered by a physician or nurse practitioner, somebody like that. So when the criminal code was introduced in Canada in 1892, both suicide and assisted suicide were criminal offenses. Suicide was decriminalized in 1972. And now, as of June 2016, assisted suicide was legalized in Canada as the exception to the criminal code. So basically, the Medical Assistance in Dying Act established eligibility criteria and procedural safeguards for medically assisted suicide. So in 2016, it was you had to be near the end of your life and you had to be suffering. But in 2021, legislation was passed that expanded. You didn't need to be terminally ill. The other piece I think that's significant to point out about the 2021 legislation is that now a medical professional can be your witness and sign off. So what can happen is a patient can be in the hospital, and a nurse maybe who thinks this person should take MAiD can sign off on that choice versus family or somebody else. And so what's happening is there's literally family members that die, but nobody in the family even knew they were going to choose MAiD. So that is a really unfortunate reality of what we're living in. So the government was going to expand MAiD to patients with mental illness beginning this March, but now they have a bill that will delay that by a year. The challenge is the minister who presented this, he didn't present it in a way that said, you know what, we have some concerns, maybe we're moving too fast or maybe this isn't the right direction for Canada. He said our healthcare system isn't ready, basically insinuating that there's just going to be this influx of patients who are going to choose MAiD for mental illness. So I'm not sure if that's really what he intended by those comments, but it didn't really sound all that promising. Between 2016 and 2021, over 31,000 Canadians chose medical assistance in dying. In 2021, it was the 6th leading cause of death in Canada. And these numbers are underreported, because there'll be patients who request that their death isn't listed as MAiD on their death certificate, but rather their underlying condition like cancer or whatever it would be. But what's interesting is when it comes to choosing between euthanasia or assisted suicide, virtually 100% of people choose euthanasia. So stats can be hard to find, but I got this. This is out of Ontario. So since MAiD was legalized in 2016, to the end of October, now just the most recent October 2022, in Ontario, 13,011 people died by MAiD. Only 3 of those self-administered. It just shows that people don't want to do the act of killing themselves, but somehow when somebody else does it, it sanitizes it. The other thing I would want to point out is for people who push back on this to me, there's one nurse in particular, she's on the MAiD team at my local hospital, I believe, and she's always pushing back to me, and her rationale is that, but it's a peaceful, beautiful experience, as if the experience itself is what makes it right or wrong. So for example, anything you do when you put somebody to sleep is going to be peaceful, right? You're putting somebody to sleep, then you're euthanizing them. So yes, that is going to be peaceful, but many things would be peaceful if somebody's asleep. The other thing I like to consider is, does your perspective change if the act was done by gunshot, for example, or if the act of death was done in a different way? So yes, it's a lethal injection and it's all peaceful. Does the morality or ethics of it change if the act is different? And I think it does for people. If, our doctors are shooting people with a gun to end their lives, I think people would be really horrified. But because the act is done in a peaceful way, it sanitizes what's actually being done. Okay, so why are people choosing MAiD? This is directly from the government's website. The reasons most people choose MAiD is not because of physical pain. It's for things like loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities, loss of ability to perform daily activities. Now, inadequate control of pain or concern, those are two different categories. Like, are you in pain or are you concerned about being in pain? Because most pain can actually be managed. I'm not saying all pain can be managed. So then even this, you get a high percentage, but my question would be how many people are in pain or just scared of suffering? So it's not physical pain actually that causes people to choose MAiD. It's more losing the ability to do the things that make their lives meaningful. I'm sure you've heard the stories. Poverty and housing are also playing an increased role in MAiD deaths. About 3 weeks ago, a 38-year-old woman contacted me, and she said we're her last hope. She's visually impaired. She's 38 woman. She's visually impaired, so she can't be as independent, obviously, because she can't drive and get out as much. But she wants to choose MAiD. Like, visually impaired. That's why she wants to choose MAiD. And I'm like, well, what's going on? Well, her housing isn't great. She's living in housing downtown Winnipeg. She wants to move. But these are things that should be able to be overcome, not choosing MAiD. MAiD shouldn't be the treatment option. And there's one more thing. Speaking of treatment options, the one other thing I'd like to clarify is that Canada is the only country that I know of that doctors are allowed to bring up MAiD to a patient. In other countries, like in Europe, the patient is the one who has to bring it up. So that's really different, like if the patient brings it up versus, a doctor saying, well, here are your treatment options, and MAiD being one of them. So that's also playing a role, I think, of why it's so popular in Canada. Here's the thing, though. Only 30% of Canadians have access to proper palliative care. And proper palliative care helps people live well, not just focusing on them dying well. So what we really need is better palliative care in our country. I also want to clarify, I'm not advocating for disproportionate medical intervention to keep somebody alive. Like, we're all going to die. We know that. And if somebody is, near the end of death, I'm not saying we need to try indefinitely and do all sorts of invasive treatments to try and keep somebody alive. But what we want to do is keep them comfortable while they die naturally, not just necessarily keep resuscitating, etc. MAiD removes the ethical and moral responsibility society has to take care of the aging and vulnerable under the pretext of compassion and personal liberty, personal autonomy, when in fact MAiD is a deliberate strategy by the government to save on healthcare costs in an unsustainable universal healthcare system. So last week again in Vancouver during the Q&A, a nurse stood up. She was very mad, very upset with me, saying that is not true. The government is not trying to save money on that. And I just said, okay, the Parliamentary Budget Office literally has aligned the cost savings from people choosing medical assistance and dying. And it was a fine conversation. But then after I was done presenting, another nurse came to me and she just said, oh, in our hospital, she goes, MAiD is presented all the time to save money. So it's interesting how our personal experiences, so a nurse in one hospital doesn't experience this like a nurse in another hospital would. So I'm sure you've noticed our culture increasingly believes it is better for people to die rather than to face any kind of suffering or potential suffering. Further, as the rate and rationale for MAiD expand, at what point will the right to die turn into the obligation to die? Will someone be encouraged to die by MAiD to free up a hospital bed for somebody who has a better chance at survival? Or donate their organs to someone whose life is deemed more valuable? So this is actually a huge issue. So MAiD patients, they sign up for organ donation. And globally, Canada makes up 50% of the organ donations from MAiD patients. And now I've heard of cases where it's being presented, your organs can save 13 people if you die now before your condition, whatever you has, gets too bad. So it's almost being presented as an altruistic thing that you're doing, right? If you die now, you can save 13 people. So I think that this piece is concerning to me as well. Are we going to feel obligated to choose it? As with abortion, Canada is the least restrictive country in the world when it comes to euthanasia. To put into perspective how out of control MAiD is in Canada, consider this. The state of California legalized MAiD in 2016, the same year as Canada. Virtually have the same population, California 39 million, Canada 38 million. In 2021, 486 Californians died by MAiD compared to 10,064. So that just shows how extreme Canada is, because, California is considered quite a progressive and liberal state. And the reason for this is, again, the safeguards. In California, you have to be suffering and very, very near the end of life. It's really supposed to alleviate that last piece. Where in Canada, there's very few safeguards put into place, and they're loosening. So why is this happening? I talked a little bit about the material worldview. The challenge with that is our Christians who are choosing MAiD. We even hear of churches performing MAiD in their buildings. So that's not the only piece, but to a certain degree, it is. We're going to die anyways. Our life has no purpose after this. Doesn't matter if we cut it short. Universal health care is certainly a piece of that. Our universal health care system is not prepared for aging population, and the majority of healthcare costs come at the end of our lives. And then personal autonomy again. You know what? Nobody wants to say anything or, say, this isn't right, because we don't want to interfere with a person's personal autonomy. But to be honest, MAiD actually puts more limits on our autonomy than just committing suicide. I'm not advocating for people committing suicide. But really, if you want total personal autonomy, we can take our lives whenever we want. So it is interesting how MAiD is, it's personal autonomy. Well, it actually puts limits on our personal autonomy to a certain degree. The other thing, families of patients who choose MAiD, for the most part, are really, really hurting. Last week, a gentleman came to our booth, and his sibling had chosen MAiD 2 weeks prior, and he was just devastated. Another woman came, and she said her daughter's mother-in-law had chosen MAiD, and the family really hadn't wanted her to, and now all these grandkids just don't understand. My grandma left early. So yeah, it's personal autonomy, but our decisions do also have a huge impact on the people around us and in our lives, and I think that's something we need to consider. Like abortion, MAiD is not compatible with Christianity. God is a God of life. He gives life and values life. The Bible says, do not murder. So that, I don't want to call people murderers. That's not what I'm saying. But really, we are not supposed to intentionally take life. And the Bible also tells us to care for the vulnerable and to stand up for the defenseless. Speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Proverbs 31 is a clear mandate to be a voice for the vulnerable. So I just want to talk a little bit about what Christians can do to support life. I often get asked how I can do this work. As you can imagine, you have get some interesting emails and messages and conversations when you do this kind of thing. But I really believe this is just a huge opportunity for the church and for Christians. Is there any other issue in the world that impacts 72 million people every year? Babies, women, dads, families. Christians in the church have a massive opportunity to put our faith into action here, to care for the vulnerable, whether it's babies, women, or the lonely or elderly. Valuing babies and women and the sick actually is what attracted people to Jesus, what actually kind of kick-started Christianity in Roman times. Christians were the ones who were caring for people. What if the very thing we are silent about is the very thing that could revive our churches? So ways you can be pro-life and live with a pro-life ethic. Care for others. We need to, it sounds simple, but we really need to care. Care about women, care about babies, care about the elderly, care about the sick, care about post-abortive women. Don't just pretend to love others, really love them. And people aren't projects. We don't want to just check off a box, okay, we're doing our duty, but really develop relationships with people. I'd say we need to recognize that we are foreigners. Our culture, people have only heard one side, right? So we need to approach it realizing we are in the minority. We need to be persuasive and nuanced, not angry and dogmatic. Calling hurting women murderers and evil is not conducive to persuading people on abortion. It just makes us look like jerks, to be honest. I think people are looking for safe conversations about this, and we just really need to be sensitive about our language. If we go to a new country, whether we're on vacation or moving, we don't storm in there demanding people do things our way. I mean, I think statistically, 6% of Canada are evangelical Christian, and I think 8% of Canadians are 100% pro-life. So we're really in the minority, and I think we need to approach it in a way where we try and, influence where we can. Teaching a healthy sex ethic. So we really need a healthier sex ethic in our culture, and we need wisdom how to frame these discussions. We need to teach it to our kids. We need to have just good conversations about that, and we don't necessarily need to approach it from a Christian perspective. Again, we're the real minority. We need to have we're in a pluralistic country, we need to have ways to approach it that aren't necessarily specifically Christian. So the books I mentioned have so many good stats on how harmful casual sex is to women and girls. So I think we can talk about some of those types of things. Celebrate and support incremental gains. So I think this is why we don't have legislation. There's a lot of groups that want all pro-life or nothing, which would be nice. But I'll just give you an example, an unfortunate example. There was an NDP MP in Ontario a few years ago that wanted to adjust the health legislation so that if a baby was diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome, there'd have to be a waiting period before parents scheduled an abortion. She saw that there's discrimination against Down syndrome people. But yet there's pro-life groups that spoke against this because it's nope, it doesn't go far enough. The legislation should be no Down syndrome kids are aborted. Well, we know that, but this was actually real progress, right? In a secular culture to make that progress where, an NDP MP is valuing life and sees this. That's something we should be celebrating and saying, hey, this is a step in the right direction. I think it's better to save some lives than no lives. Reaching one person. Joseph Stalin is reputed to have said that the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of 1 million is a statistic. And Mother Teresa once said, if I look at the mass, I will never act. So if those two agree on something, I think we should probably listen. Basically, this means that as the number of victims goes up, so does the motivation to help them go down. It's overwhelming for us if we look at the masses. And I think it's exacerbated in our social media culture where it's unless you have a certain number of likes or followers, we don't count, we're not influential enough. But I really think we need to focus on reaching even just one. If we all reach one, we'll make a huge impact. There's a poem called Awaken. I think it captures this well. It says, one man awake awakens another. The second awakens his next door brother. The three awake can rouse a town by turning the whole place upside down. The many awake can cause such a fuss. It finally awakens the rest of us. One man up with dawn in his eyes, surely then multiplies. I think that captures well. Equip yourself. When you have knowledge, it's easier to stand up against some of these rationales and arguments that are presented. And recognize the extremes. Some of those angry and extreme supporters of abortion are ones who've had abortions. I think we really need to see people as humans first. And address the pain or whatever the person is feeling first before we try and get into those conversations. But my experience with the average person, pro-choice, pro-abortion person, it's really easy to have a reasonable conversation on it. Even if we don't end up at the same place, it's usually there's a lot of common ground. So I think it's important for us not to go in their guns blazing, but rather to, in humility, approach people about this or talk about it if they have questions, and not get too intimidated by the extremes. So, I believe the future of the pro-life movement is churches and individuals and small groups changing hearts one at a time, and ordinary people making a difference in creating a culture of life. In closing, I want to read you a beautiful statement of faith on the sanctity of life that my friend sent me, that's his church conference has. I'm just going to read that in closing. We believe that all human life belongs to God. Each person is created in the image of God and ought to be celebrated and nurtured. Because God is creator and the author and giver of life, we oppose all actions and attitudes which devalue human life. The unborn, disabled, poor, aging, and dying are all particularly vulnerable to such injustices. Christ calls the people of all nations to care for the defenseless. God values human life highly. Ultimate decisions regarding life and death belong to God. Therefore, we hold that procedures designed to take life, including abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide, are an affront to God's sovereignty. We esteem the life-sustaining findings of medical science, but recognize there are limits to the value of seeking to sustain life indefinitely. In all complex ethical decisions regarding life and death, we seek to offer hope and healing, support and counsel in the context of Christian community. And I think that's just a great summary of what it means for Christians to live with a pro-life ethic. All right, that will wrap up the presentation portion. And now it's time for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can ask them here or go ahead. Well, it's expensive, first of all. And, there's not enough, on my board, there's a PhD, a doctor of nursing who specializes in palliative care. And according to her, it's not really taught that much, because you go to med school, you get a little bit of everything. So there's just a lack of people specializing in it. There's just a lack of resources for it, right? Because one of the things is once this demographic, ages and passes away, I think to a certain degree the perspective is we just kind of need to push through this aging demographic, and once we get to the other side, things will ease up. But it's really just, it's mainly financial and a lack of expertise, according to her at least. And I think the other thing about palliative care is often perceived as what really hospice should be. Somebody has a terminal diagnosis and it's end of life. Palliative care should actually start at time of diagnosis, whether a person's terminal or not. Palliative should start at diagnosis, and a plan should happen right at the beginning. So I think our culture even needs a different perspective of what palliative care is. It shouldn't be perceived as end of life care. It should be perceived as, how do you live well with a diagnosis? Go ahead. Did you raise your hand? Okay. Oh, what our organization personally would do? Well, we don't do formal counseling. We would do peer counseling. And what our organization does is we help women in crisis, but that usually looks more like financial support, because what you'll find is when a woman is in a crisis situation, it's really there's a lot of stress and she can't see what's in front of her immediately. So if we provide rent for 1 to 3 months, that kind of thing, it gives her time to think about the situation a little bit. So that's kind of more how we would approach what we do. There are there's Winnipeg Pregnancy Crisis Center that would do more of the counseling piece rather than what we would do. And hopefully we try and find her support, people to walk alongside her, depending on her family situation. Those are some of the practical things we would do. Go ahead. Can you try using this?
Hope I get through this. I'm a nurse that works in home care, and I recently came across a patient on my assignment who was in severe pain. And, I just tried to support her in that. She said she's had this pain for a year and a half and doesn't know what to do, and she's wanting to end her life with MAiD. And she was in her 80s, she was older. I went against, I guess, what I should have done according to the government, but I tried to encourage her to call her doctor and get some help for her pain, that's the issue at the heart of it. First, she wasn't happy with me, but then she ended up thanking me at the end for my compassion. So she made a phone call. She had a phone call appointment already booked with her doctor for that week. And I said, you know, this is what you should ask for, and tell him just how desperate you are. She did all that. She actually wrote it out on a whole loose leaf paper, everything, you know, so that she could say it just right. And at the end, he said nothing except gave her the phone call for MAiD. And this shocked me. I just want to comment just so people understand what's happening out there.
Yeah, that's a very terrible story. There was a study done in Ontario, Southern Ontario, care before MAiD, prior to 2016, and care after MAiD. And it just showed, in that study, it said in that area, care dramatically decreased, proper care decreased to patients because, first of all, you have this option now for MAiD. So doctors were suggesting, not all doctors, I know a lot of doctors who don't support this, but you know, it became an easy treatment option. So patients weren't getting the care they were getting before that, and I think that's probably would apply across the board. Like in theory, 95% plus of pain should be able to be managed, right? So that's a really disappointing story. But the reason partly is if somebody wants to choose MAiD, the doctor wasn't giving the medication that would prevent the pain in case it would cloud their judgment about MAiD. There was just all sorts of factors that were related to it, but that's exactly the whole thing. In other countries, a doctor wouldn't be able to do that. That would be illegal. You have to treat the condition unless the person, that's really a terrible story. Is there any other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Do you find that there's a reluctance or a caution among our church pastors to teach about this topic in young people's programs?
Yeah, like since Roe v. Wade was overturned, we are having more success in getting to churches, but I think that's because congregations have been asking their pastors about this stuff. Prior to Roe v. Wade, and that's just less than a year ago, it's been very hard. It was very hard to pastors. I'm not speaking for all pastors, but it certainly was resistance. Don't want to be political. Don't want to hurt the feelings of women in the congregation. Don't want to, there hasn't been a lot, but you know, in fall we started hosting these pastors' lunches and pastors' events, and and just in Manitoba, we've had over 125 come to them. And so there is, it's starting to happen. And the other thing, there's a bit of distrust, because some organizations they've had in their congregations have been showing like aborted fetal parts or have been really graphic, which has turned people off, so they're a little bit nervous. So we're just trying to come in maybe with a gentler approach. So I don't know if that's helping as well. In Vancouver last week, there was like Vancouver churches, from my impression, are talking about MAiD for sure and talking about this stuff. There was a much greater sense of urgency there. Here, I wouldn't say quite as much, but I think it's beginning, so that's good. I mean, if Christians don't support this and know what they're talking about, really, how would we expect culture to as well? Is there any other questions? If not, you can also come talk. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just wondering if you have any specific or different guidance for a male on how to address somebody who's talking about abortion. Like specifically addressing a woman.
Find a woman to talk to the person. I mean, really, in our culture, you don't have a voice. For the most part, you don't have a voice. I would say the best thing men can do is like advocate, like, yeah, the dad should take responsibility. Yeah, this is not fair to you. It is not right that you are carrying that. Like, I think more that kind of thing, affirming that, you know what, because when you're in that situation, the woman does want support from the dad, is not getting it. So I would rather affirm this is what this is what the role should look like. You should be supported. You should have this, kind of just affirm that. But it is just harder for men to talk about in our culture. Maybe not as much with, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It is, men are at a disadvantage talking about it, yet they really have the biggest influence on what a woman decides. So it's kind of interesting.
So I'm a nurse as well, and I was reading a magazine, and they talked about a recent bill, I believe, that was turned down to try protect healthcare workers that don't want to participate in MAiD. Can you comment on that?
Okay, well, so in the federal legislation on MAiD, it says there's conscious rights protections. I've heard mixed stories from people, again, depending which region or hospital you work in. Some hospitals will like tell a person they know who doesn't want to do it, we're doing it. Make sure you take a vacation day, or even just say you don't need to participate in this. So I don't know that there's a clear answer. The legislation says there's conscientious protections. However, healthcare is delivered provincially as well. Provincially, Manitoba is the only province that has conscience rights protection, provincially as well. So I think it's kind of a hospital-to-hospital kind of basis. And even if there's conscience rights protection, I mean, depending on the doctor and the staff too, like depending how you're treated within that, it just is such a wide variety. As of now, yes, there's supposed to be protection. Provincially, Manitoba is the only one who's formalized it. So I think it probably just depends. Okay, go ahead.
Consider expanding into, like, not even with like abortion topics, but just finding good Christian counselors in general, right? Because counseling is such a liberal thought, right? Like,
yeah.
And you had said you guys support like in crisis mode, but I'm just curious to know if that's something that you would expand into.
Well, I do know counselors. Like, I would be able to suggest counselors to people who come in. We just, in terms of what we do, it would be peer counseling, but if there needs to be more formal counseling, we do have like qualified volunteers, but there's only so much time they can give as well. It would be very beneficial to expand that. Right now, we're not quite there yet, but we do have recommendations. We also have an amazing women's resource guide. It's like 15 pages, and what it does is centralizes like all the supports kind of in Manitoba that are available, from whether it's a suicide hotline or pregnancy crisis center, or where you can get help. So that's also on our website. We have cards for that at our booth. So we are trying at least that way. If we can't do it, here's where you can go. According to Cindy. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can gladly ask me after. And if you're interested in the slides, I can get you the slides. We also have some information at our booth, stats sheets and stuff like that, if you're interested.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. We do have another session in here at 1:15, so maybe if you do have, I would encourage your questions, but maybe we can take them and find Susan outside there. That's good. Thanks for coming.